So imagine a country that has multiplied its economic output by like nearly 10 times in just over 60 years.
Which is a massive, massive leap.
Right, a total transformation. And they've radically increased their life expectancy too. Plus, they've achieved this historic gender parity in early education. So on paper, it sounds like the ultimate developmental victory, you know?
It really does. It sounds like a textbook success story.
Yeah, but, and here's a hook for you listening. Imagine that in that exact same country, more than half of the youth drop out before they even reach high school.
Yeah, over 50%.
Exactly. And they have these deeply entrenched governance issues that are just, well, they're so frozen in time that they threaten to completely stall this huge engine of progress. So today we are looking at this ultimate macroeconomic paradox, which is Guatemala.
And it is honestly one of the most fascinating case studies in modern economics right now.
Oh, totally. Welcome to another deep dive, by the way, to the listener out there, the learner. We're thrilled to have you here. We've got this massive stack of sources on the table today.
A really dense dossier.
Yeah, it's a comprehensive, multi-dimensional data analysis report on the national development of Guatemala, and it tracks everything from 1960 all the way up to 2022.
Because when you look at a developing middle-income economy, I mean, the transition is almost never this clean, linear, upward trajectory.
Right, it's messy.
Exactly. It is incredibly messy. You have these sectors of society that are just accelerating into the 21st century, while other sectors are quite literally anchored to the mid-20th century.
And that tension is exactly what we are decoding today. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this mountain of historical data, mostly from the World Bank and other demographic surveys, to understand the hidden mechanics of a society that is basically in flux.
And the goal here isn't just to, read off a spreadsheet.
Right, no one wants to hear us just list numbers for an hour.
Exactly. If you're prepping for a meeting on Latin American markets, or if you're just insanely curious about how macro-level data physically translates into human realities, you really have to look past the top-line numbers.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to look at 4 core metrics today, right?
Yes. GDP, total population dynamics, gross national income, and the human capital index.
Which is the HCI.
Right, the HCI.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we're going to explore the connective tissue between them. Data isn't just numbers, it's a heartbeat.
I love that. So let's jump right into the sheer scale of the output growth because the first chart in this dossier is just staggering.
The GDP transformation.
Yeah, the transformation of output. We are looking at Guatemala's GDP, and this is measured in constant 2015 dollars. So back in 1960, the total economic output of the nation was roughly $7.6 billion.
Which was a fairly modest starting point.
Very modest. But then you fast forward to 2021, and that number has exploded to $75.1 billion.
Which is, a nearly tenfold increase in real inflation-adjusted terms.
Right, and we should clarify for the listener, since it's in constant dollars, we've stripped out the illusion of inflation.
Exactly. That growth represents a massive physical expansion of economic activity. It's not just money losing value. It means more concrete actually being poured, more goods crossing borders, more telecommunications networks being built.
But the number that actually stopped me in my tracks wasn't the peak, it was the valleys. Or, well, the lack of them.
Ah, the resilience test.
Yeah. Look at the 2020 global pandemic. We watched these advanced, highly sophisticated economies all over the world just contract by massive margins, like 5, 6, sometimes over 10%.
Total economic freefalls in some places.
Right. But Guatemala's GDP, it only contracted by a remarkably mild negative 1.5% in 2020.
Which is barely a blip compared to the global average.
It really is. And the very next year, in 2021, it rebounded with a massive 8.0% growth rate. It's like comparing the Guatemalan economy to this incredibly shock-absorbent off-road vehicle.
That's a great analogy.
Right. It hits a global pothole like COVID-19 and just bounces right back. But wait, how does that actually work mechanically?
Well, it's
because if a country has less institutional infrastructure than a highly developed nation, shouldn't a global shock like a pandemic just shatter it completely? Why didn't this economy just freeze?
That's the billion-dollar question. And the answer lies in the very nature of how the labor force is structured there. The data points us straight toward the massive informal economy.
Ah, right. The off-the-books sector.
Exactly. When a highly formalized economy gets hit by a shock, it freezes. It seizes up because it's bound by rigid contracts, commercial leases, rigid supply chains, and a total reliance on government stimulus to keep payrolls afloat.
Right, the formal machinery just stops working.
Yes. but an informal economy, which forms a massive percentage of Guatemala's daily commerce that operates on pure, immediate adaptation.
Like street vendors and stuff.
Exactly. A street vendor, an unregistered day laborer, a local market stall, they don't wait for a government bailout.
They can't afford to.
Right. They don't have corporate overhead or complex payroll systems. If one avenue of income closes on Tuesday, they pivot to a new one on Wednesday because, well, survival demands it. This extreme flexibility acts as this incredible macroeconomic shock absorber.
Okay, let me push back on that framing, though.
Sure.
Because calling it a shock absorber makes it sound like this brilliantly engineered feature. But isn't an informal sector, almost by definition, totally unregulated and untaxed?
It is.
So if a massive chunk of your workforce is operating entirely off the books, how is the government supposed to capture the tax revenue needed to build out the infrastructure? I mean, the stuff that actually gets a country out of the middle income trap, it sounds less like a shock absorber and more like a parasite on state capacity.
Well, that is the exact paradox.
Yeah.
And your skepticism there is entirely warranted. The informal sector is this short-term survival mechanism that creates a long-term developmental ceiling.
A ceiling, right.
Yes. Did it keep the economy from contracting by 10% during COVID? Yes. Did it keep people fed? Yes. But you are absolutely correct that it starves the state of the fiscal resources required for long-term investments.
Because you can't build a highway with unregistered cash.
Exactly. You cannot fund a nationwide high-speed rail network or a world-class public university system by taxing informal street commerce. It's just mathematically impossible.
Which brings us perfectly to the gap between the size of the national economy and the reality of the individual citizen. Because the total GDP, the size of the whole pie, grew tenfold. But the gross national income, the GNI per capita, tells a much more sobering story about the size of the slice each person actually gets.
Right. The reality of individual wealth.
Yeah. I mean, imagine you're listening to this, right? Imagine your company's profits go up 10x, but your staff size goes up 8x. Are you actually that much richer per person?
Not nearly as much as the headline suggests.
Exactly. So look at the data here. The adjusted net national income per capita went from $245 in 1970 to about $3,639 in 2022.
And if we look at the most recent 2023 indicators using purchasing power parity,
The PPP.
Yeah.
right, which adjusts the numbers to reflect what that money can actually buy in the local economy, the GNI PPP sits around $12,262.
So it's growth, sure, but it is nowhere near a tenfold explosion in individual wealth. And the timeline in the sources shows it wasn't a smooth ride at all, was it?
Not even close. There is a brutal, steep drop in per capita income right in the early 1980s.
Yeah, that massive dip. What happened there?
Well, that severe dip aligns with periods of intense internal conflict and regional instability across Central America. When you have severe domestic friction, capital formation just halts.
Domestic supply chains get completely disrupted.
Exactly. So after that massive destruction of value in the 80s, the country basically had to spend the next 30 years grinding upward just to recover and build momentum.
Just to get back to baseline, basically. But even with that 30-year upward climb, the per capita wealth just feels so sluggish compared to that top-line GDP number. I have to ask, challenge you a bit here. Why is the denominator, the individual, share lagging so far behind the numerator?
Well, it's because the denominator was exploding.
The population.
Yes.
Bruh.
The core mechanical reality of Guatemala's late 20th century is that a massive amount of its output growth was fundamentally eaten by population expansion.
So if 40% of the population is suddenly aging out of childhood and needing jobs, where are they physically going? Because they certainly aren't staying on the farms.
Exactly. And to understand this, we really have to look at the demographic transition. In the mid-20th century, as basic public health finally began to penetrate the country, far more children survived infancy.
Which is a good thing.
A wonderful thing. But birth rates remained incredibly high. So the population didn't just grow, it skewed dramatically, overwhelmingly young.
The population pyramid charts from the sources are wild. I was looking at this, and in 1960, the youth dependency ratio, meaning the number of children aged 0 to 14 who are relying on the working age population, was an overwhelming 91.2%.
I want you to visualize the sheer economic gravity of that number for a second.
It's heavy.
It is. A 91.2% youth dependency ratio means that for almost every single working age adult, there is a dependent child to feed, clothe, and shelter.
It's essentially a 1-to-1 ratio of earner to dependent.
Precisely. And mechanically, what does that do to an economy? It completely obliterates the capacity for household savings.
Because you're spending everything you make just to keep the kids alive.
Yes. If every cent a worker earns goes into immediate caloric intake and basic survival for a dependent child, there is zero capital left over at the end of a month. You can't put money in a bank. And if money isn't going into the banks can't lend capital to local entrepreneurs to build businesses.
The entire society is just trapped in this cycle of immediate consumption.
Exactly. But, and this is the crucial part, the data shows a massive shift on this front. Fast forward to 2023, and that youth dependency ratio has dropped all the way down to 57.3%.
Wow. From 91.2 down to 57.3.
What's fascinating here is that this drop signifies the opening of what economists call the demographic dividend. This is the golden window.
Okay, explain that. How does that window actually operate in real life?
Well, as birth rates gradually decline and those massive generations of children grow into adults, the ratio flips. You suddenly have a massive wave of young, energetic people entering the workforce, but proportionally fewer young dependents trailing behind them.
So families finally have more earners than dependents.
Yes. For the first time, a household might have 3 working adults and only 1 child. Suddenly there is surplus income. They can actually save money.
And the banks get deposits.
Right. Interest rates can stabilize, businesses can borrow to expand, and the government finally has a broad, vibrant tax base. It is a macroeconomic tailwind that fueled the rise of almost every developed nation in the late 20th century.
But, and this feels like the crucial caveat here, that dividend isn't just magic, right?
No, not at all.
It's just a raw supply of labor. If you have this tidal wave of young people entering the workforce, they need a place to go. If they don't have jobs, that demographic dividend turns into a demographic disaster of unemployment and instability.
Exactly. The window is slowly opening, but the society has to absorb them.
Which naturally leads me to ask, what kind of economy are these millions of young Guatemalans actually walking into right now? Because the structure of the economy has completely shapeshifted over the last 6 decades.
It has. And to answer that, we have to look at the sectoral shift. This is one of the most reliable trackers of a middle-income transition.
Right. The sources map out the value added by different sectors over time, like a pie chart changing.
Yeah.
Decades ago, agriculture was the absolute heavyweight. It was the center of the economy. But over time, agriculture has steadily shrunk as a percentage of total economic value.
And at the same time, the services sector has just ballooned.
Yeah, the data shows that today, services account for over 60% of Guatemala's entire GDP.
Which is the macroeconomic footprint of rapid urbanization.
Moving from the fields to the cities.
Exactly. Mechanically, agricultural labor on small rural plots has a very low ceiling for worker productivity. As the population grows and land becomes scarce, young people migrate to the cities looking for better wages.
But they aren't walking into massive, highly mechanized automotive factories, are they?
No, they aren't. Unlike the industrial booms of East Asia, which absorbed rural migrants into export-driven manufacturing, this specific transition leaned heavily on the service sector. The city basically becomes this massive sponge.
Okay, but when I hear services sector accounting for 60% of GDP, my mind immediately goes to like the American or European model. I think of software engineering, financial consulting, healthcare administration, banking. Are we talking about high-tech, high-wage jobs here?
We are not, and that's a very common misconception. In the context of a developing middle-income transition, services is a notoriously broad umbrella. It certainly includes a growing formal sector, telecommunications, banking, formalized retail. But the vast majority of that sponge is the massive, sprawling, informal sector we discussed earlier.
So we are back to the street vendors, the gig workers, the unregistered transport drivers?
Yes. The informal service sector absorbs the labor force because the barrier to entry is practically zero. You don't need a high school diploma to set up a food stall or drive an unregistered taxi.
Right. Which totally explains why the economy is so resilient to shocks, like we saw in 2020.
Exactly. But it also perfectly explains why the GNI per capita, the individual wealth, is so painfully slow to grow. Informal services inherently mean low margins, low wages, zero benefits, and almost no opportunity for skill compounding.
But the data also shows that Guatemala isn't just an isolated bubble of informal street markets. I mean, they are actively plugging into the global matrix. The trade openness indicators are really fascinating here.
They are.
Because trade as a percentage of GDP basically fluctuated from around 27% in 1960 to a high of 56% in 2022. They're moving goods across borders at a scale they never have before.
And global capital is highly aware of this geographic positioning and this demographic window.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Look at the foreign direct investment, the FDI. The charts flag this abnormal, massive spike in net FDI inflows in 2021. It hit approximately $3.6 billion.
That is a huge jump.
Right. What is driving that specific spike? Like, what does $3.6 billion of FDI actually look like physically?
Well, an FDI spike of that magnitude usually represents multinational corporations making hard physical bets on the country. We're talking about nearshoring.
Okay, break that down for the listener.
Sure. In the wake of the 2020 pandemic, global companies realized that having all their manufacturing and supply chains concentrated in Asia was a massive liability. So they started looking for locations closer to the massive North American consumer market.
And Guatemala is geographically primed for this.
Perfectly primed. That $3.6 billion is going into manufacturing facilities, textiles, agricultural processing plants, and telecom infrastructure.
So international investors clearly see the potential in that young workforce. They see that 57% dependency ratio dropping. They see millions of young people ready to work right in the backyard of the United States.
Exactly. It is a massive vote of confidence from international capital.
As I was combing through the external balance sheets, I hit a massive, glaring issue.
The trade deficit.
The trade deficit. Guatemala runs a persistent, long-term, deep trade deficit. Year after year, they import far more goods and services than they export.
Yeah, the lines on the external balance chart diverge significantly, and they stay diverged.
Now, let's unpack the mechanics of this, because in a normal economic model, if a country bleeds cash like that for decades, buying more from the world than it sells, it drains its foreign exchange reserves.
Right. Usually, yes.
The currency should theoretically collapse, inflation should skyrocket, and the ability to import basic goods should just grind to a halt. So how is this economy surviving a perpetual trade deficit without collapsing?
Well, if you only look at the trade balance, you would assume the economy was in a perpetual state of terminal crisis. But there is a hidden variable in the balance of payments that completely alters the equation.
And this might be the most fascinating data point in the entire report. I'll just reveal the hero of the balance sheet here: personal remittances.
The magic lifeline.
It is magic. The charts show remittances skyrocketing from almost nothing a few decades ago to an unbelievable height of over 19% of the entire GDP by 2022.
Remittances are the ultimate macroeconomic shock absorber. They are the true engine keeping the domestic consumption cycle liquid.
Just to put that into perspective for you listening, nearly 1/5 of the entire economic output of the nation isn't actually produced inside the country.
No, it's not.
It's cash generated by Guatemalans who have emigrated primarily to the United States, and they are wiring a portion of their paychecks back home.
And mechanically, the flow of this capital is incredibly efficient.
How so?
Because this is hard currency, mostly U.S. dollars flowing continuously, month after month, directly into the pockets of local households. This money bypasses a government bureaucracy entirely. It doesn't get caught up in inefficient state allocation. It goes straight to a mother, a brother, a grandparent in a rural village or an urban center.
And what happens the second that cash hits the household?
It is spent immediately. They buy construction materials to expand their homes, they buy groceries, they pay for private medical care, they buy clothing.
Which fuels domestic consumption.
Exactly. This massive injection of domestic consumption is precisely what fuels that 60% service sector we talked about earlier. The informal retail markets thrive because there is a constant river of dollars flowing in from abroad.
And that completely masks the structural weakness of the trade deficit.
It does. It provides the central bank with the foreign exchange reserves necessary to keep importing all those goods from the rest of the world. Without that 19% remittance buffer, the purchasing power of the entire country would contract violently.
I have to admit, my immediate reaction to that is deep skepticism about its long-term viability.
You're not alone in that.
Because relying on your own citizens leaving the country to keep your economy afloat feels fundamentally fragile. I mean, what happens if immigration policies in the U.S. change overnight? Or what happens when those immigrants face an economic downturn abroad? You are basically outsourcing your macroeconomic stability to the labor market of another country.
And your skepticism is widely shared by developmental economists. It is highly fragile. While remittances solve the immediate problem of poverty and consumption, they can also trigger a localized version of Dutch disease.
Dutch disease, right? Where one influx of cash hurts other sectors.
Exactly. Because families are receiving income from abroad, the pressure to develop highly competitive, export-driven domestic industries is slightly relieved. It creates a comfort zone that can disincentivize deep structural reforms.
So if we look at the big picture so far, you have a massive young population, an expanding service sector, billions of dollars flowing in from abroad through remittances, and FDI spiking. Sounds like a recipe for a boom. But let's pivot and look at the human beings behind these numbers. Because the human capital metrics, surviving versus thriving, are really where the rubber meets the road.
Absolutely. The macro stage is set, but an economy is only as capable as the humans who operate it.
Right, and this is where the numbers stop being abstract and become intensely personal, and we really have to start with the most uplifting, undeniable triumph in this entire data set. If you want to know what human progress physically looks like, you just look at the public health metrics here.
The transformation in survival metrics over the last 60 years is profound. It really is.
In 1960, the life expectancy at birth in Guatemala was a mere 46 years.
46.
Yeah. Today, it has surged to over 69 years. But even more dramatic than that is the data tracking under 5 child mortality. The charts show it plummeting from incredible, tragic highs in 1960 all the way down to just 23 deaths per 1,000 live births in 2021.
I cannot overstate what a monumental achievement in public health this represents. Dropping child mortality by that magnitude doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
It shows that basic survival conditions have taken a quantum leap forward.
But how did a state with historically weak institutions actually execute a quantum leap in public health?
Well, it was achieved through highly targeted, aggressively focused interventions. You don't necessarily need a perfectly functioning, corruption-free bureaucracy to run a successful national vaccination campaign.
Right, you just need the vaccines and the people to deliver them.
Exactly. You need targeted international aid, active NGOs, and a dedicated cadre of local health workers. The global push for immunization, particularly the DPT vaccines highlighted in the data, combined with basic maternal education on hydration and nutrition, physically changed the survival odds for millions of infants. They basically conquered the most brutal, easily preventable elements of extreme poverty.
Wow. But, the data also forces us to look closer at the geographic reality. Because while the aggregate national number is this massive triumph, the breakdown shows deep, persistent inequalities.
So the rural-urban divide.
Yeah. The sources highlight this divide specifically regarding basic infrastructure. If you look at the usage of basic sanitation facilities, urban areas are doing relatively well. They're sitting at about 90.9% coverage. But then you look at the rural areas, and they lag significantly behind at only 59.9%.
And we really have to explain the mechanical link between plumbing and human capital here. Because sanitation isn't just a comfort issue. It is the bedrock of cognitive development.
Wait, how does rural plumbing connect to cognitive development?
Through waterborne diseases.
Oh.
Yeah. If 40% of the rural population lacks basic sanitation, children are constantly exposed to pathogens. They suffer from repeated chronic diarrheal diseases. And when an infant's body is constantly fighting off intestinal infections, it cannot absorb nutrients.
So even if they're eating, they aren't getting the calories.
Exactly. This leads to physical stunting. But more critically, it leads to cognitive stunting. The brain simply doesn't get the caloric energy it needs to develop neural pathways during those critical early years.
It's like a house where the foundation is finally solid, the kids are surviving, but half the rooms still don't have plumbing. So before they even step foot in a classroom, they're biologically disadvantaged.
Exactly. The survival metrics are a triumph, the kids are alive. But the thriving metrics, the conditions required to optimize that human potential, are deeply uneven.
Let's look at education, because that is the next logical step. And here again, we see a massive historic victory, specifically regarding gender.
The great gender parity victory.
Yes. The data shows adult literacy growing from 64.2% in 1994 to 83% by 2021. But crucially, the female literacy rate rose sharply, jumping up by 17.4%.
And the Gender Parity Index, the GPI, illustrates this beautifully.
I was looking at that. Back in 1970, the GPI for primary school enrollment was 0.82. That meant far more boys were going to primary school than girls. But by 2021, that index has risen to a near-perfect 1.0.
Mechanically, this represents a profound cultural shift. It means that the societal expectation has normalized. A little girl born in Guatemala today has the exact same statistical probability of walking through the doors of a primary school as a little boy.
That's incredible.
It is. The institutional barrier at the entry level has been entirely dismantled.
So girls and boys now have equal access to the starting line. They are all in the building. But, and this is where the tone of the data shifts dramatically, staying the building is a completely different story.
This is the great paradox of the Guatemalan transition.
Yeah. I pulled up the enrollment data from the sources, and it essentially forms a funnel. And frankly, it is the most alarming visualization in the entire report.
The leaky bucket.
Exactly. At the top of the funnel, primary school enrollment is essentially universal. It hovers right around 101%, meaning there are even some older kids catching up on primary grades. Everyone is in the system. But then you move down the funnel to the secondary school level. Total enrollment for secondary school collapses to roughly 47.7%.
More than half the population vanishes from the formal education system.
I am trying to visualize this mechanically. It's like a bottlenecked assembly line in a factory, right? You have a massive supply of raw materials entering the factory doors. That's the universal primary enrollment. Every kid is there.
Right.
But the machinery required to refine those materials, the secondary schools, the specialized teachers, the accessible rural high schools, is either broken or entirely missing. So the materials just pile up on the factory floor, and eventually they are forced to leave the factory completely unrefined.
That is a highly accurate, if sobering, metaphor. And what happens to that unrefined material in economic terms, they enter the informal labor market as low-skilled, minimum-wage gig workers.
And we have to connect this back to that demographic dividend we talked about earlier.
Exactly. That massive, once-in-a-century youth bulge that was supposed to act as an economic tailwind. The data is telling us that more than half of that demographic wave is entering the labor market as teenagers without a high school diploma.
Wow.
You cannot harvest a demographic dividend if your future workforce is dropping out in middle school.
But the data gets even more granular regarding what happens to the kids who actually stay in the system. The sources highlight an indicator called learning poverty.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most critical metric for long-term economic forecasting.
So the learning poverty indicator measures the percentage of children who are finishing primary school but are scoring below standard foundational reading proficiency thresholds.
Which is terrifying economically speaking.
It really is. It implies that even among the kids who successfully navigate the primary system, a highly significant percentage are moving on or dropping out without the basic cognitive ability to comprehend a simple text.
Let's role-play the macroeconomic consequence of this for a second. Imagine you are the CEO of that multinational company we discussed earlier.
Hey, I'm the CEO.
You are looking to invest a massive chunk of that $3.6 billion of foreign direct investment. You look at the map. Guatemala is right next to the U.S. Perfect.
Perfect.
You look at the demographics, a massive youth population, dependency ratio dropping. Perfect.
Right, I'm ready to sign the check.
But then you look at the human capital data. You realize that more than half of your potential labor pool doesn't have a high school education, and a significant portion of them actively struggle with basic reading comprehension. What specific factory decisions do you make?
Well, I completely alter my investment strategy. I mean, I'm not going to build a high-tech R&D facility or a complex aerospace parts manufacturing plant or a sophisticated financial services hub. I can't. The local workforce doesn't have the baseline skills to operate the machinery or process the data.
Exactly. You downgrade the complexity of your investment. You build a basic textile assembly plant or a low-skill packaging facility. You bring in low-wage jobs, not high-skill, high-wage knowledge jobs.
And this perfectly synthesizes the bottleneck. This collapse in secondary education, combined with high learning poverty, is the primary physical barrier preventing Guatemala from evolving out of a middle-income, informal service economy and transitioning into a high-skill, high-income knowledge economy.
Yes.
The raw human potential is there, the survival rates are incredible, but the skill acquisition is completely stalling out.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate question of state capacity.
Right, because as a layperson looking at this, my immediate reaction is, well, fix the assembly line. If you know the kids are dropping out and you know the rural areas lack sanitation and you know you have $75 billion in total GDP, why isn't the government just building more secondary schools, paying teachers better salaries, and laying down plumbing in the rural provinces?
Because to build schools and lay plumbing, a state needs capacity, efficiency, and the ability to capture revenue. Which brings us to the final dimension of the data. Governance.
The invisible ceiling. Let's look at the institutional capacity charts, because the World Bank tracks several global governance indicators. And unlike the GDP or the life expectancy, which shot up like rockets over the decades, the governance lines are shockingly flat.
It barely moved.
The corruption control percentile ranking has been stuck at a dismal low, bouncing between the 11th and 30th percentile globally for a very long time. The indicators for rule of law and government effectiveness show absolutely no meaningful improvement over the past decade. In fact, in some specific aspects, the trend lines have slightly declined.
And this raises an important question. We need to look at this impartially, strictly as an economic mechanic. When economists look at a stagnation in institutional reform, they don't just see a political issue. They see a massive economic friction cost.
Friction! That's the perfect way to describe it. It's like trying to drive a semi-truck with the parking brake permanently engaged.
Mechanically, how does a state capture the tax revenue needed to build out a secondary school infrastructure if government effectiveness is mathematically low? It can't.
It just leaks out.
Yes. When corruption controls in the 11th to 30th percentile, it means that public spending is inherently inefficient. A dollar allocated for a rural sanitation project might only result in 40 cents worth of actual pipe being laid in the ground. The rest is lost to friction.
And going back to our FDI CEO, that friction acts as a silent tax on foreign investment. Investors will tolerate a lot of things, They will tolerate poor infrastructure if they can build their own. They will tolerate an unskilled workforce if they can train them. But unpredictable rule of law and high institutional friction, that deters the kind of long-term, multi-decade capital investments that actually build economies. It keeps the investment focused on short-term, easily extractable returns.
And speaking of extraction, we have to touch on the physical reality of the economic growth itself, the environmental toll.
Right, the sustainability aspect.
Yes. The environmental data shows that as the GDP has expanded tenfold, CO2 emissions have tracked upward synchronously.
Which makes sense mechanically. More trucks on the road, more concrete being poured, more electricity being generated. The data also closely tracks natural resource rents, which is the revenue derived from extracting minerals, forests, and energy as a percentage of GDP.
And what's fascinating here is that this environmental footprint is incredibly typical of early-stage industrialization and rapid urbanization. Every developed nation has gone through this exact curve. However, in the 21st century, the rules of development have changed.
You can't just burn your way to prosperity anymore.
Exactly. The data implies that the efficiency of natural resource utilization has to improve. If the country is going to manage a green transition, it needs the governance capacity to regulate resource extraction without choking a very economic engine that is lifting people out of poverty. It requires highly effective, transparent government policy to balance extraction with sustainability.
So what does this all mean? We have gone through 60 years of data across 4 major metrics. Let's just recap this epic developmental journey for a second.
Let's do it.
We are looking at a country that has achieved a genuine miracle in macroeconomic growth, multiplying its output by 10. They have fought a heroic, victorious war against child mortality, adding decades to the average human lifespan. And they have conquered the historical gender divide at the starting line of education.
Historic achievements.
But they are tethered to the ground. They are relying on a sprawling informal sector and an overdependence on remittances cash from citizens who had to leave to act as an economic shock absorber. They are bleeding more than half of their youth potential through a bottlenecked, underfunded secondary school system. And they are trying to push through all of this with an engine suffocated by the friction of stagnant governance.
That is the precise synthesis of the data right there. Guatemala is standing at a historical crossroads. The demographic window, that once-in-a-century wave of young workers, is open now.
Yeah.
The clock is literally ticking on that dividend.
Pressure is on.
It really is. If they can address the governance friction, if they can capture public revenue efficiently, and if they can unblock that assembly line and keep those teenagers in high school learning real skills, the sky is the absolute limit for their economic trajectory. They have the physical energy and the geographic location to become a regional powerhouse.
But if they don't?
If those structural bottlenecks remain, they face a very common, very dangerous economic reality.
Yeah.
The middle-income trap. They risk the ultimate demographic tragedy, growing old before they grow rich.
Growing old before they grow rich. Wow. That puts a profound ticking clock on this entire data set.
It really does.
For you listening, I really hope this deep dive changes how you hear the news. The next time you see a headline celebrating a country's GDP growth or a stock market booming in an emerging market, you now know the secret questions to ask. You know to look past the top-line billions and ask, yes, but what is the secondary school dropout rate? Who is actually getting that income? Learning to read this data isn't just about understanding one country in Central America. It is a masterclass in how macroeconomics, demographics, and human potential constantly intersect, collide, and shape the physical world around us.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative puzzle to ponder on your own. It's a thought experiment built entirely on the data we just analyzed.
Oh, I love these. Let's hear it.
We have seen that personal remittances, billions of dollars sent from citizens who left the country, are the magic lifeline keeping the domestic economy afloat and masking the trade deficit.
The 19% buffer.
Exactly. But consider the long-term timeline of human migration. As those original immigrants settle permanently abroad, as they buy homes in their new countries, and as they have children of their own second-generation citizens who have perhaps never even seen Guatemala, will that new generation feel the same obligation? Will they keep sending 19% of the national GDP back across the border?
Oh, wow.
What happens to the entire macroeconomic suspension system when the emotional ties to the homeland inevitably begin to fade?
That is a staggering question. The data can only show us what has happened. It's really up to us to anticipate what comes next. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep digging into the mechanisms behind the numbers, and always remember to look for the human stories hiding inside the spreadsheets. Until next time.